My name is Benjamin Anton. I'm the founder and the director of the organization Our Soldiers Speak. I was born, raised, educated in the United Kingdom, to the degree that I am educated. And upon graduating high school, I had the great privilege of being accepted into the University of Manchester, which is a very fine institution of higher education in the UK, and I've no idea how I gained admission. But I did so during the events of the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada, for those who are less familiar with that, was a massive wave of homicide activity, undertaken even at the cost of suicide by those who perpetrated that activity, against innocent Israelis, Jews and non-Jews, throughout the state of Israel, killed in the course of doing the perfectly ordinary. Jews and non-Jews killed by these murderers simply because they were resident or passing their time on any given day within the state of Israel. And as a student campaigner, standing on the student union steps, I became deeply, deeply alarmed by the reality that no matter how many citizens of the Jewish state were blown apart, no matter how many restaurants converted into killing fields, no matter how many hotels during the Passover ceremonies were turned into massacres, there seemed to come about absolute consensus between the members of the United Kingdom, from the academicians to the students, from the professionals to the laity, from the politicians to the voters, behind the idea that the people of Israel had no right whatsoever to defend themselves. And it was as I witnessed those scenes that I resolved that my future exclusively would be in the state of Israel. I therefore, upon graduation, having earned a degree in history, literature, and politics, go and make a living out of that degree choice, if you will, moved directly and had the privilege of being drafted shortly thereafter. There's a misnomer, an odd phrase that's being bandied about throughout the state of Israel now that refers to what they call in Israel the shivyon banetel, equality of the burden of service in the Israel Defense Forces. That is a misnomer because service in the Israel Defense Forces is no burden whatsoever. It is a deep, deep privilege, and I'm grateful for the fact that we do have the Israel Defense Forces. When I was drafted, I had the honor of being a full and frontline participant in the Second Lebanon War of 2006. I continue today as a combat reservist, and I was drafted into the operation known as Pillar of Defense in 2012, and again into Operation Protective Edge during the summer of 2014. So I know a thing or two about what transpires in the battlefield. What I always try to achieve when I have the privilege of addressing myself to an audience such as this, or any other, frankly, is a means of communicating the harsh reality that transpires between the headlines. Not by way of body counts or by reports from the field, but rather by the conversations that take place between soldiers. There was a great Israeli poet named Amir Gilboa. He moved to what was then Palestine prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, and writing of the attitudes of the nations towards the Jewish people, he wrote the following 3 stanzas. He said, Im yaruni even v'omar even, yomru even. Im yaruni etz v'omar etz, yomru etz. אך אם ירוני דם, ואומר דם, יאמרו צבע. The translation of that is that Gilboa stated that the attitude of the nations of the world towards the Jewish state was thus: if the nations of the world show me a Jew, a stone, and I concur that it's a stone, they will say, yes, it's a stone. If they show me a tree and I say that it's a tree, they will say, yes, it's a tree. But if they show me my Jewish blood, and I concur that, yes, it is my Jewish blood spilled, they will say it's not blood. They will say it's just paint, that it has no worth whatsoever. And as we see our civilians and our citizens, our men and our women, our children, our soldiers and our police officers in the state of Israel, finding themselves in a situation where their throats can be slashed by stabbers, finding themselves in a situation where they are rushed to critical care, once again, as a consequence of merely living within the state of Israel. And we witness the near total silence by the media around the world on this point. I ask you, has anything changed since the writing of Gilboa? Well, the purpose of the Israel Defense Forces, friends, is simply to ensure that Jewish blood is never again rendered as a commodity without value, but rather that Jewish blood will not be spilled. And in the event that tragically it should be spilled, it will not go unanswered. When one first goes to war, one becomes very emotional about the concept of going to war, and then one loses that emotional connection. I'm guilty of losing that emotional connection. But then there are events that cause one to feel more emotional than one could ever anticipate. And I want to give you one example of such events, and then look forward to introducing the president of our organization, Rosita Panini. In 2014, the state of Israel found itself being rocketed once again by way of munitions being fired from the Gaza Strip. Unlike on previous occasions, the number of Israel's citizens living within the range of rockets emanating from the Gaza Strip rested no longer at 1 million of our citizens, no longer at 3.5, but at 5 million. It's no exaggeration to say that's approximately 2/3 of the Jewish population of the Jewish state. To put that into American terms, that means that all of the United States from the eastern seaboard to approximately Colorado would be blanketed by rockets. And those sorts of threats need to be beaten back, but that's not what I want to talk to you about, because you can read that in the papers. What you cannot read in the papers is that I sat in my office, which back then was immediately adjacent to IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv. And I expected the telephone to ring because I'm a combat reservist. And it did ring. And my youngest brother, Alexander, I'm one of 7 children, I'm the 3rd in line for dinner, Alexander is the 7th, picked up the phone, and I was certain that it was the drafting office, and indeed it was. But they were seeking not me, they were seeking Alexander, the youngest of my family. He'd recently been released from conscripted duty as a tank driver. And a mere 6-7 weeks thereafter, he was informed by the drafting office that he was to report to the base. And I immediately found myself in the dreadful situation of having to drive my youngest brother quite literally to the gates of war. And I did drive him there. And he got out of the car and he exited. And I briefed him as best I was able on matters such as when it's appropriate to adhere to using the gun and when it's more appropriate because of the proximity of the battle to throw the gun aside and perhaps draw the knife. A dreadful conversation that nobody would ever wish to have with one's sibling or frankly with anybody. And then I hugged him and I watched him walk off into the distance with all of the attendant threats. Tanks are a big target for the enemy. And even though he's very much his own man, in my eyes, as his older brother, he'd never looked quite so vulnerable. But he was certain of his path forward. My friends, what's so very striking about the story that I tell you of driving Alexander to the gates of war is that in Israel it's so perfectly ordinary. It is the story of every mother and father and brother and sister. And what unfortunately is being lost is what it is we're actually fighting for. And after all is said and done, after we consider the democratic nature of the State of Israel and the technological advent of the States of Israel, we're fighting because that tiny strip of land is the homeland of the Jewish people. It's the one and only Jewish state. And it's damn well worthy of being defended. And it is worthy of us sending forward our sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters, even with a heavy heart. Because if we do not do so, nobody else will. We should not forget that as we escort ourselves throughout this evening together. That even as we convene in this room, there are those on those front lines who defend that country on behalf of all of us who hold it so dear to our hearts. Before I invite Rosita to take the podium, I want to acknowledge some dear, dear friends of our organization who have been instrumental in bringing about such a robust attendance. I'd like to thank the organization Camera, with whom we have a wonderful working relationship and who were actually the first organization to allow our soldiers speak to come to university campuses. I want to thank Americans for a Safe Israel, Unite for Unity, and also the Zionist Organization of America, one of the few organizations on the face of this earth that actually has an opinion and actually dares to speak that opinion. Thank you so very much for all that all of these organizations have done. A final word. I want to acknowledge our security detail for keeping us safe. I want to thank our dear team member, Michael Feder, for all that he has done to bring this about. Thank you so very much, Michael. And I want to make special distinction of Richard Offenbacher. Richard Offenbacher came to us, when was it, Richard? A year and a half, but nobody's counting, right, Rich? Richard, you have escorted Colonel Dr. Bader throughout the United States because I left my most recent reserve tour with broken ribs. I was unable to travel. We feel very honored to have you here, and this night, make no mistake about it, anybody would not have been possible without the stewardship, leadership, and tremendous work ethic and dedication of my dear colleague, Richard Offenbacher. And with that, I invite Rosita Panini to take the stage, please. We're going to flip the order around. Rosita will take the stage, and I'd also like to invite Colonel Dan Goldfuss and Tony Badran to please take your seats.